Now, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Martha Nussbaum, who is, without doubt, one of the world's foremost public intellectuals. She's Professor of Law and Ethics in the Philosophy Department, the Law School, and Divinity School at the University of Chicago. She's the author of many books, including The Fragility of Goodness, Women and Human Development, The Capabilities Approach, and Hiding from Humanity, Disgust, Shame, and the Law. Her work resonates both within and far beyond the confines of academia, contributing to international dialogue, shaping and framing national debates, and engaging with the most enduring and fundamental questions of human nature and existence. So we're privileged to welcome Professor Nussbaum to the RSA today, and she has kindly agreed, and this is a real honor, to just have a conversation with me and then with you around two things, really. Firstly, we're going to take advantage of you being here to talk about the RSA's new strapline, 21st Century Enlightenment, and what that means, some of the ideas that underlie that, and get you to reflect on that. I hope you don't tear it apart too much, because we've put it on our stationery now. And then secondly, to talk about your new book, Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And talk about prescience. This is a book that was written, when was this first published?
Last April, so very recently.
But nevertheless, this book's published last April. It does contain references to the decision of the previous government to emphasize the importance of relevance and impact in research, and bemoans that kind of reductionism. But the book is mainly a plea to governments around the world, and to citizens indeed, to ensure that we continue to support humanities and arts. And so, as I say, it's a very prescient book, because as we know, our own government, facing public austerity, has recently decided to withdraw all public funding for humanities teaching in higher education. So you were kind of ahead of the curve in your warning. Perhaps the book should have come out here a bit earlier. I don't know. So those are the kind of two things that we're going to talk about. We will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions for the audience. Is that okay? Good. Thank you. And we'll make sure you leave at 2 promptly. So, Martha, if we can start with this concept of 21st century enlightenment, which is our attempt to relate modern challenges to the origins of this organization 257 years ago in the original Enlightenment period. So this idea really has got 3 pillars, and I'd like to discuss them with you in turn. The first pillar, and of course you yourself have done so much work in this field, relates to the question, what kind of capabilities do citizens need in the 21st century? We have argued that tomorrow's citizens need to be more engaged, by which we mean more willing to understand the issues around them, and more willing to give for it, not more willing to participate, but also more willing to give permission to their leaders to make the right decisions for the long term and for the good of the world. Secondly, the need for citizens to be more resourceful, have a greater sense of efficacy, more creativity, more self-sufficiency. And thirdly, for citizens to be more pro-social, more civically minded, more willing to recognize society only flourishes if we give something back to society. And I'm interested in your notions about what you see as being the core capabilities that we need, that the citizens of the 21st century will need.
Well, I think this is a great project, and I think it's wonderful to rethink the Enlightenment in the context of a very different world. And I guess I would say that there are 3 things that we badly need in this new Enlightenment. And the first is very old, and it really is what Socrates first brought up, and that is the capacity for self-examination and searching critical thinking. Thinking that rejects the guidance of authority and tradition and really asks, what do I want to stand for? And I think that's much more needed even now than it was in ancient Athens, because we are in a very complicated world where personal accountability is much more difficult because the world is so complicated, but it's also much more important because we can't afford to be just told what we should think about China or about India. We have to search it out for ourselves. Second, and this is very closely connected, is a sense of global citizenship. The old Enlightenment was the thought about empire. And we really have to rethink Enlightenment with the idea now of a world in which all human beings have equal dignity, and we'd better become curious about all of them and not purvey false and stereotyped pictures of what an Indian is or what Hinduism is, and so on. So genuine curiosity about the plurality of the world's people, the plurality of cultures and religions, and then combined with a sense of human dignity, a sense of what does it mean that there are such glaring inequalities between countries, and a willingness to think about that very courageously. And then finally, and I think this is very closely linked to the other two, empathy, which you talk about in your pamphlet in a very lovely way. That is the capacity to really think what it might be to be in the shoes of someone else who's different from yourself, whether it's by race or by gender or sexuality or distance in culture and religion. And of course, to do that fully aware of the limitations of any kind of empathy, because we don't even really know ourselves, and therefore how could we really expect fully to understand someone very different from ourselves, but a humble and genuinely curious attempt at empathy.
Interestingly, today before we met up, I had a meeting with the global head of Gallup, who are working on a kind of well-being index and are doing some work in the UK, because David Cameron has asked us to examine this kind of idea of well-being, and so they feel they're in the task of remaking Maslow's hierarchy and understanding the kind of basis for well-being. And there's some interesting things that are coming out of their work. The primacy of security as being the baseline for everybody, that people, more even than health and anything else, people need to feel a sense of basic security in their lives in order to have any sense of flourishing. But also, interestingly, finding that civic engagement is an important part of well-being. People need to feel a sense of connection, and this seems to be strongly correlated with people's sense of well-being. Where do you think, in terms of your own analysis of human capability and human development and the skills and the attributes that people need for the 21st century, what's your kind of sense of where we are in the world on that? Are we developing in the right way? You know, is the progress? Should we feel confident?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think no in the sense that global inequalities are increasing, not decreasing. But yes, in the sense that I think we're a little more aware than we used to be of the defects in previous models of global development. It used to be that you measured development by simply looking at gross national product per capita, and that was a measure that, of course, doesn't even factor into account gross inequalities, so that it would just give high marks to a nation that had a lot of wealth in it, no matter how that was distributed. But it also didn't take apart and separately consider aspects of human life like health, security, as you say, education, the quality of race and gender relations, which are not always very well correlated with gross national product per capita, nor indeed our political liberties, as the case of China dramatically shows us. So now we understand that that measure is a bad measure, and I hope that your government will follow the excellent lead that I think was given by the commission that President Sarkozy of France commissioned. It was headed by Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, which did propose a measure of well-being in terms of human capabilities across a wide range of areas. So it was very nice to see that recognized by at least one government, that the way you really want to look at things is to ask the simple but also very profound question: what are the people actually able to do and to be? What opportunities do they really have to lead healthy lives, creative lives, educated lives, and so on? And the pursuit of mere national wealth does not deliver that.
And do you think this conversation about, this richer conversation about well-being, we saw it in the Sarkozy Commission, David Cameron's talking about it. Do you get a sense as you travel around the world, I know you've done a lot of work in India, for example, that there is a general recognition that sheer economic growth is not a sufficient way of understanding progress?
I think that there's certainly a recognition now that distribution matters hugely. And so, no Indian government could survive unless they could show some progress in the state of the rural poor and their inequalities, or gender-based inequality. Whether that translates into an understanding that we need to consider separately areas such as health, education, political and civil liberties, that's less well understood, I think. And there still are plenty of people who think that promoting growth is the best way to deliver all these different advantages, even though empirical studies of the different Indian states that Sen and Gendrez did show very dramatically that it doesn't, that states that pursued a growth-dominated agenda don't have particularly good records in health and education, and then the Indian state of Kerala, which pursued an agenda focused on health and education, did well in those areas, but it didn't promote economic growth. So these are separate aspects. So dealing with incommensurable goods is what we have to learn to do. And I think one very fine guide to that is the book by Jonathan Wolfe of University of London and Avner de Shalit, who's from Israel, called Disadvantage. And they give what I think is the best account in philosophy of why we should think that any good thinking about poverty has to deal with incommensurable goods. And then quite pleasing to me, they use something like my capabilities approach to go further on that.
If we think about this issue of human capability, this leads to the second pillar of the kind of idea of 21st century enlightenment, which is needing to understand who we are as a species. You know, Daniel Dennett has said that the problem for the human race is that we're trying to cope with the modern world using prehistoric brains. Right. And of course, one of the changes, I think, in thought accelerated by the credit crunch was a rejection of the kind of homo economist view of human beings, that we are understood as separate, wholly sovereign individuals pursuing our self-interest, perfectly informed in a perfect marketplace. And of course, it turns out that we are more instinctive, more social, more idiosyncratic, more moral, more in some ways than we might have thought. How relevant do you think is the sort of the science of behavioral science to these kinds of debates?
Oh, I find it fascinating. Now, I will say right away that I think we didn't need this science to tell us that people are not wholly dominated by self-interest. I think we could have read novels and poems and so on. And yet, of course, when someone challenges that, it's very good to have good empirical research that establishes that very, very clearly. And I think the research is great interest. Paul Bloom at Yale talking about the moral capacities of young babies, of psychologists that I'm particularly impressed by, Daniel Batson talking experimentally, rigorously about the connection between compassion and helping behavior and between hearing a narrative and the experience of compassion. And there's so much more, and we could go on and on. So I think understanding better both what our capacities are and then what our pitfalls are, because we also have, as a species, pitfalls, that some of which are part of our animal heritage, such as narrowness of thinking, a tendency to clannish family and local community-oriented thinking. But then there are some that don't seem to be part of our animal heritage, that are just maybe byproducts of the human desire to be more than human, which is something that no other species has. So the rejection of its own species nature, which is the capacity to feel disgust at our own animality and its signs, the desire to target other people and groups by saying they're disgusting and they're mere animals. So these are, again, the subject of very important psychological research, and it's research that tells us that we've got big problems as a species that are at the bottom of a lot of the worst conduct that we engage in. So I think any proposal for political principles for the future or political culture needs to understand all of the resources and the problems.
The 18th century Enlightenment, the kind of precursor to that, I think you could argue, was scientists who, Copernicus or Newton, or who did two things at once. They challenged the received view of the world that was provided by bishops and kings, but they also challenged our intuitive sense of the world. You know, it may have felt as though the sun went round the earth. Yeah. That's maybe what religious leaders and kings said, but actually that wasn't what was really going on. Do you think that this understanding of the idiosyncratic nature of human behavior has that kind of power as well? Not only does it undermine the power of an individualistic account of human behavior, because it says that individualism really doesn't, we are not separate individuals in that way. We are very much social beings. But it also challenges us to question our own kind of intuitive sense of the world. There's a wonderful book, it's a very popular book, but one of the books very influential on me was a book called Stumbling into Happiness by Dan Gilbert, which is just about how bad we are at predicting what's going to make us happy, for example.
Yeah. I think that's true. And, going back to what I just said about disgust, I also think that this new research upsets our sense of the ladder of nature by telling us that we're not the best and the top in the world, but actually there's some respects in which animals have a capacity for unconditional love and affection that's not tarnished by some of the defects peculiar to the human species. So I think that's also very useful, learning how much animals understand of the world, learning their emotional capacities, but learning also that there are certain kinds of atrocity that are peculiarly human, and they come from our own fraught relationship to mortality and to animality. I do think that reorients us, because for thousands of years we've thought, oh, well, there's this ladder in nature and the human species is at the very top.
Which takes me to the third leg of the 21st century Enlightenment argument, but also I think we'll end up with an opportunity for you to kind of talk for a few minutes about the core thesis of your book before we open it out. So the third idea is that if you put together this notion of who we need to be in the 21st century and who we really are as a species, it leads you to want to ask questions about how we've come to interpret core Enlightenment principles. And the first one of those principles is the principle of autonomy. And it calls, for example, I think, for us to say that genuine autonomy has to be self-aware autonomy, that we have misunderstood freedom as simply being possessive individualism. So we misunderstood freedom as simply being having what I want now. And that actually, and this is, of course, a strong religious tradition, that genuine freedom comes from an awareness of ourselves, of our own idiosyncrasies, of the fact that very often our needs are not the same as our wants.
Yeah, I think the Socratic idea of self-examination is, of course, older than the Enlightenment idea of autonomy, and in a way it's maybe a better idea because Enlightenment autonomy is linked so profoundly to anti-clericalism, and I think in a modern culture where there is a plurality of religions and a plurality of secular views of human life, it's arrogant and disrespectful to be anti-clerical in terms of the way you frame your political principles. No, you shouldn't establish one religion as the religion of the country and denigrate others, but you also shouldn't establish anti-clericalism as the public spirit of the country. So you have to figure out a way to show equal respect to all your citizens, whatever their religion or non-religion. So I think that means a real rethinking of the Enlightenment notion of autonomy, which certainly was linked to the idea that religion would wither away and we would somehow have a different culture after it ceases to exist. So that's, therefore, just thinking about self-examination. That's a much more neutral notion, it's a much more respectful notion, something that we can all share in schools where there's a plurality of religions around. And I do think that it makes great sense for every child who's going to be a citizen to be exposed to Socratic questioning and debate, because how can you have a mutually respectful political culture without that sense of respectful interaction, but then how can you have that without having self-examination first?
And then the second idea that the Enlightenment idea is the idea of universalism, of fairness. And of course, you've done a lot of work about, as it were, what should be universal entitlements or capabilities. But of course, a question that underpins that is, why is it that we want to be fair to each other? Why is it we would buy into this idea of universalism? And that takes us to this notion of empathy and of compassion. And I know that you've been doing some thinking about the nature of empathy, but also about the kind of double-sided nature of compassion as an idea.
Yeah. Now, of course, I've always thought that empathy and the real ability to see another life from its own point of view is absolutely fundamental to any morality that's going to be worthy the name. However, it also seems clear, and now it's experimentally clear, that there are a lot of tensions between the experiences we have of sympathy and our principles of fairness, so that in some of Batson's more recent experiments, he will talk to people about what they think the fair principle for allocating scarce medical treatment is. Then they get clear about that. Then he tells them a very vivid story of one person's particular plight. And then they're all of a sudden willing to throw their principles out the window and give that person first place on the list, even though by their own account the person doesn't deserve that. So I think that's just very common in daily life. You can think about it in medical contexts all over the place with organ donations where somebody gets on TV and says, oh, I really need a kidney, or just any kind of allocation of resources. So we need to strike the right balance because principles without empathy are obtuse and dead and usually don't succeed in seeing the full humanity of each and every person. But then we can't run a culture by compassionate philanthropy alone. I mean, that would just be back to the Victorian era. We need laws and principles that treat everyone fairly.
And then finally, and hopefully carrying into the arguments in your book, the third Enlightenment principle is humanism, or the idea that human affairs should be organized not according to the rules of religions or the rules of kings, but according to what maximizes human well-being. And out of that springs utilitarian tradition. And I wonder whether you agree with the argument that we find it hard to have a conversation about what progress comprises. That we have powerful logics in the modern world, the logic of science and technology, the logic of markets, the logic of bureaucracy. And somehow people feel there is a missing center to our public discourse, which is a conversation about the kind of future we want. But that then takes us to what are the kinds of tools that we need to have that conversation, whether it's at the national level or in an organization or in a school or in a community. And I think that might carry you into some of the arguments in your book about where those kind of skills come from.
Yeah, I guess just to briefly say, I think the word humanism needs to be carefully understood, because if it means anti-religionism, well, then we're back to some of the points I made about autonomy, that we don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives. So I would rather say something like human dignity, because that's a notion that's been used internationally by both religious and non-religious people, and it's very, very happily accommodated in the discourses of the religions. But also, I don't want to say humans are better than animals, because I actually believe that politics of the future has a very strong place for the rights and entitlements of animals, and I'm very concerned about that. So with those two qualifications, okay, humanism or human dignity, well, I think first we need to learn to think critically, and we need to do that first as children. Children are very good at recognizing the bad arguments their parents give them. They should be encouraged. They should be encouraged to challenge, to question, and to do so in an increasingly formal and sophisticated way. But then I think, of course, I'm talking out of the liberal arts tradition of the US, in universities, they should all study some philosophy, because doing that in the more formal way, really reading the dialogues of Plato, it helps you do it in a way that nothing else does. And I should say that John Stuart Mill gave that as one of the reasons why he thought the Scottish system was better than the English system, because it did encourage all university students to read the dialogues of Plato. Second, knowledge of world history, knowledge of the global economy, and knowledge of the major world religions. And so all of that being done, of course, in a critical spirit, in a way that teaches you how to assess historical evidence, not just to parrot the narrative you learn from your teacher, and so forth. And then finally, the training and increasing refinement of the sympathetic imagination. Again, Mill, in his wonderful rector's address at St. Andrews, recommended that as part of university education. He called it aesthetic education. And developing more refined capacities for thinking sympathetically about the lives of fellow citizens, including a particular focus on groups that we happen to see obtusely. In any given time, there are always going to be groups who are rendered invisible. Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man, was the story about how in racist America, a black man is invisible because, as he put it, the inner eyes of the white population have not been cultivated. So a cultivation of the inner eyes, and sometimes that does require focusing on your particular blind spots.
And your book is written with a sense of urgency, because your view is that we're losing sight of the importance of this kind of thinking of the humanities in education and moving towards a much more narrow, much more instrumental view.
Yeah, this is happening all over the world. And I have to say, It's happening because people think economic growth is so urgent, we have to seize a larger part of the global market, or we have to keep the part that we have. But even from the point of view of that narrow goal, it doesn't work. Singapore and China have recently had big education reforms aimed at infusing more critical thinking and more arts into the curriculum because they see that they lack innovation and they lack internal criticism within the business culture, which is not particularly healthy in a business culture. So even in that case, where their goal is very narrow, they've seen the need for the humanities and the arts. But then if what we want is the kind of political culture you've been talking about so nicely, where people are involved, where they participate as citizens, where they think well about the problems facing the world, well, then we need this all the more. And we need it not just in primary and secondary school, but I would say in a more sophisticated form in university education. And so it's very, very troubling to me to see these cuts because I think politicians are not thinking of the long-term health of democracy. They're not really thinking, what will happen if 20 years down the road, if we're producing these machines who are churning out national profit rather than producing complete citizens?
And I think you're going to say the answer to this is both, but are you saying that we need to continue to invest in the humanities because actually the competencies that people need in the workplace and in communities have to include the humanities, or are you also speaking to a different kind of idea of the good life well lived? So if I could prove to you that merely focusing on a narrower, more instrumental approach would lead to higher economic growth, would you be converted by that? Or?
Oh, well, of course, I don't think economic growth is the goal of society any more than you do. I think that's a goal, and it's a useful goal, but the societies that we want include much more. They include political rights and liberties, they include participatory democracy, they include good gender and race relations. So, in terms of the kind of political culture that we want and need, then the narrow technical education doesn't deliver the goods. It may be true, as Singapore and China think, that it doesn't deliver even the narrower goods of economic growth. But even if they prove wrong about that, I think we just have to think of a bigger picture. We don't want to be, at least I think we don't want to be like China, where people are not genuine participants, where they don't have liberties of speech and expression. We want the political culture that we have to be continuing into the future. But that means we need to continue to produce people who keep that alive.